charity is far superior to force. This is going to be a long response to this particular talking point because it requires that I deal with multiple assumptions. The first assumption that needs to be dealt with is that every single part of what a government does can be taken over through charitable organizations. This is simply not the case. Charitable organizations cannot take over policing, military operations, legislation, or the judiciary. All of these functions need a minimal level of regular cash injections as well as personnel and resources, and therefore are required to be paid for through some sort of mandatory funding. Judges need to be paid for their work. Legislators need to be paid for their work. Every single member of an armed force, be it land, sea or air, needs to be paid for their work. They also need to be equipped to do their job. Police officers need to be paid and equipped to do their job. The issue of whether a police force or a military are actually needed has a simple answer with a complex explanation, and the only reason the explanation is complex because Randroids insist that neither of these functions are actually required. I'll deal with these talking points at another time though. Back to this one. Every single one of the services that has been mentioned, as well as quite a few others, requires funding to do their job, and simply trying to collect as much money as possible and hoping that enough voluntary contributions will come in to make it happen is not sufficient. In this respect, when it comes to the essential services of society, charity is definitely not superior to so-called force. The next assumption that needs to be dealt with is that every single mandatory restriction or instruction given by governments is an example of force. In order to assume that this is the case, it requires that first of all, absolute ultimate freedom is both possible and as a minimum expected, and second of all, that any action that is not voluntary is therefore coercion. So, absolute freedom is impossible. Your right to freely swing your arms all over the place willy-nilly ends at my nose. Similarly, your right to take the fruit of a tree in order to further your values is denied on the basis that I own that tree. And of course, your right to drive at 150 miles per hour on the roadways of any given country is restricted on the basis that 1. Driving at high speeds is dangerous both to the driver and to any others on that road. Therefore 2. Speed limits have been instituted in order to limit the danger to yourself and other road users. And of course, your right to keep every single penny you earn from any form of employment, interest on savings or inheritance is restricted because your income is not earned in isolation and relies upon the infrastructure of the society that you live in. To deal with the issue that any and all actions that are not voluntary and are therefore an example of coercion or force, therefore they are wrong, all I need to do is point out that this is an example of black and white thinking of the sort that fundamentalists engage in, and this applies to fundamentalists of a religious nature as well as political fundamentalists such as Randroids and AnCaps. As I mentioned in previous Talking Points videos, there are no absolutes in reality. The situation and the context of an action must be taken into account. An AnCap or Randroid might say that theft is the taking of property or money without explicit consent, therefore taxation is theft, therefore it is wrong. However, a sane person might point out that there is a difference between a legitimate government of a territory taxing a percentage of you, the citizen of that territory's earnings, in order to ensure the society that you live in is maintained through the country's treasury, and some wanker breaking into your home and taking your hard-earned property that they have no right to take from you because they do not own your house nor the land that it rests upon, just so that they can go score some drugs from their local dealer. Similarly, a Randroid will say that theft is the taking of someone's property without consent, therefore all theft is wrong. A sane person will acknowledge that theft should be limited as much as possible through enforcement of the law, but will also recognize that if a kid is stealing a loaf of bread from the store and takes it home to feed his sisters and brothers, then that kid is not committing anywhere near as reprehensible act as, for example, the CEO of a bogus umbrella company whose sole purpose is to scam pensioners out of their life savings so that they can drive around in fancy sports cars while their victims are left penniless or bankrupt. Similarly, an AnCap or Randroid might say that the enforcement of laws is wrong because forcing people to do what the state says that you have to do is wrong because it takes away your free will. A sane person might argue that enforcing the law is not necessarily a bad thing because laws that protect against murderers and rapists is not a bad thing. And the sometimes mentioned Randroid argument that you can just shun and ostracize a murderer or a rapist can be countered by pointing out that often a murderer doesn't care at all if they are shunned, because they can simply just kill to get what they want if there's no one to stop them. Finally, having a sizable law enforcement agency is not necessarily a bad thing. Randroids and AnCaps often point to countries like Botswana or North fucking Korea as examples of countries with police forces and military regimes that suppress the rights of the people, not realizing that we are well aware of and oppose the existence of such totalitarian regimes. Sane people, on the other hand, might point to the existence of countries like the UK, the US, practically every member of the European Union, and various other industrialized countries as examples of states that have police forces that will only do what is necessary to protect the greater good. Which brings me on to another talking point I wish to incorporate briefly into this one. That you evil statists want to sacrifice my freedom for the greater good. You support murder and coercion for the greater good. Murder? No, I don't support murdering someone for the greater good at all. So far, however, no one among the Randroid community has been able to tell me what examples there are of people being murdered in my country for the greater good. And no, war is not an example I'm willing to accept, given that I have opposed wars recently engaged in, while it is my opinion that World War II was necessary to deal with Hitler's war machine. If you wish to use wars as an example of why governments murder for the greater good, then you are simply redefining the dictionary definition of murder. So no, charity is not superior to force. Sacrificing some freedoms in order to ensure that everyone is protected is a good thing. Sacrificing too many freedoms is clearly not, but those of us who are sane and can see reality can see that there needs to be an appropriate balance. I'd rather there be a certain limitation in people's freedoms to ensure the safety of as many people as possible, then I think it is acceptable to let people do whatever the fuck they want in order to honour this idea of freedom, with the inevitable consequence that a lot of people are either going to be killed by vulturous types or starve to death because no one is willing to help them if they fall on hard times. A Randroid might argue that if some people are lost to starvation or some other form of natural selection, then this is okay because that's just nature doing its own thing, or some other equally repugnant justification. To those people I say you can keep your precious fucking idea of freedom, because not everyone who is poor has bad genetics, and no one deserves to drop dead just because they fell on hard times. And charity will not save them all. If there is a choice between a charity that might be able to keep some of them alive, and a government scheme that is designed to protect all of them, then I know which one I would rather give my money to. That's why I pay my fucking taxes.